Alright, what's up guys? I hope you're doing well. James here from jamesdforsythe.com. So, going back through a little bit more history, right, for basically the founding of the Federal Reserve and the Aldrich Plan, right? So looking at another source that's basically pushing or showing banker support, right? This one was published on November 25th, 1911, so only a couple years before the Federal Reserve Act was actually passed, and also kind of multiple years after we kind of started the whole push towards a central banking system in the United States to begin with, right? And this was published in the Financial and Commercial Chronicle. It was a report of the ABA, the American Bankers Association at New Orleans, right? A meeting that they had. Basically, what happened at this meeting was the ABA basically said they were going to endorse the Aldrich Plan, right? Or at least on principle, right? Kind of quoting that newspaper publication to begin with. So the criticisms in nearly every case were favorable, even where exception was taken to particular features of Mr. Aldrich's proposal. There were highly flattering remarks concerning the plan itself, right? So it wasn't really viewed as in a negative light from the bankers themselves, right? Which shouldn't be surprising, and especially given what the Aldrich Plan did in terms of actually kind of laying a groundwork. It was supposed to be kind of the accumulation of all, I don't want to say all, but a significant amount of academic research that was done primarily by the National Monetary Commission, which was basically created from the Aldrich-Freeland Act, right? And I believe it was after 1907, so I'm going to say 1908 was when it was passed, but don't remember exact dates to begin with, right? And keeping in mind, a lot of the actual, especially coming from, we're going to say Paul Warburg, right? Because this is the general source that I'm using. It's the Federal Reserve System, its origin and growth, the boat anchor of a book from Paul Warburg to begin with. And as you can tell, I've gone through it quite a bit in terms of it starting to get a little worn. But right, so kind of putting a little bit of context there, right? To continue, so Mr. Aldrich's achievement in having been able to propose a scheme which has evoked such a universal chorus of praise will always rank high. The campaign which Mr. Aldrich, together with 2 or 3 other men connected with the National Monetary Commission, has been carrying on since last January has been educational to the highest degree, right? So we believe we are safe in saying that in no equal period of time in the country's history has so much progress been made in promoting sound views regarding banking and currency, right? And you'll kind of see this general theme when you're looking at kind of among different sources, and not just I've noticed there's been kind of 2 sides with respect to the founding of the Federal Reserve. For the most part, you can kind of separate them that way, to where you have the ones who are really for it or really against it, kind of like any argument. But Warburg especially is definitely for it, and basically he views not only Aldrich in very high regard, but just the system in general that was created. Basically, he makes it analogous to almost like a religious entity, right? And I don't think that's being hyperbolic in the slightest, considering the language and stuff that he uses, especially talking about the system. He, I think, almost verbatim calls the Federal Reserve the best thing that could have ever happened to the United States, like period in history, right? And kind of skipping to a separate part to kind of prove this point a little bit, and in Warburg's own words. So when Senator Aldrich revised his original views on the banking problem, and in a radical way reversed the policy of the great political party of which he was so prominent a leader, he showed extraordinary courage and vision for which the country owes him an everlasting debt and gratitude, right? So from the perspective of Paul Warburg, right, who's kind of also known as like the godfather of the Federal Reserve, because he was one of the advisors basically for every kind of group that worked on the whole progression of legislation that eventually became the Federal Reserve Act, right? From basically Warburg's own proposal of the United Reserve Bank, right? Believe it was of the United States, to the Aldrich Plan, his National Reserve Association, all of that, to the Glass-Owens bill, which eventually became the Federal Reserve Act, and also kind of advising people like a lot of presidents. Like a future video will be about how Warburg basically had significant conversations with Teddy Roosevelt, right, on kind of educating him on the banking problem, as he says it, right? So keeping that in mind. But really, this the Aldrich Plan was pretty much, it seems universally, for the most part, at this point, we'll say at this point, because it kind of could, I don't want to be too broad in this statement because that would contradict past things that I've said, specifically because think about it in terms of the kind of a timeline. So this was the end of 1911, right? And there's basically kind of broad support for the Aldrich Plan in general from the community of bankers, right? From the banking and kind of finance community on the private sector part of things, right? This was not entirely true a few years ago when the initial research was being done or conducted. Excuse me. And you saw this with a survey result basically saying, I think it was like a third, I think, of the banks that were surveyed said that they did not trust anything with regards to kind of a central banking entity. Granted, it wasn't very specific in that way. It was just kind of a generalized concept of a central banking entity, from my understanding of the survey. And basically their worry was that Wall Street would control it, right? But that's too much of a rabbit hole. But where this is really going into, especially with the ABA, is kind of the political side of things, right? And so basically this ABA meeting and their endorsement of the Aldrich Plan really kind of shows the bankers' support for it, to where that really changed and it seemed more universal in that community. However, on the political side of things with Congress, it was completely different, right? It seemed, because at least from Warburg's point of view, because he describes it as basically being impossible still politically, in terms of getting, as he says, favorable movements in Congress, right? And so that's part of the reason why the National Citizens League was created to begin with. It was kind of the whole education campaign of the public. Maybe to have, if you have the general populace kind of go for it, then you could have them vote in politicians who would be favorable to such legislation or reform in that respect, right? And the National Citizens League basically worked from mid-1911 to about 1914, right? So about 2.5 years, right? 3.5 years if it's the end of 1914. So that being said, basically continuing on how and why, let me rephrase that. Okay, so basically to directly quote Warburg on this basically political impossibility, so through its efforts supporting those of Senator Aldrich, the majority of the business and banking communities, as well as a large portion of the press of the country, were converted to the thought that the principles of the Aldrich Plan should be embodied in legislation. Kind of the public, banking, and business communities were really for it, right? And so, however, the political situation made favorable action by Congress impossible, right? And he goes further on to say it was a matter of great doubt whether the Democrats in Congress would be willing to give to a Republican president the prestige which would come from an accomplishment so monumental as the enactment of this important piece of legislation, basically the Federal Reserve. So certainly, it was not to be expected that they would endorse a bill which carried the name of the outstanding Republican leader. So, as with everything with politics, it seems, the fact that it was even called the Aldrich Plan, right? And this was something that kind of in the group itself for the National Monetary Commission, they really did not want it to be called the Aldrich Plan. They wanted Aldrich's name to not be on it, but he seemed very adamant that it was, obviously, as that's basically how we learn about it today. So, kind of also to look in a little other side of this whole banking problem, right? You have to keep in mind that this is in late 1911. What else was going on during this time? Well, the Pujo Committee, right? Basically, Samuel Untermeyer's kind of cracking down on the money trust, right? That whole money trust investigation, the Pujo Committee and those hearings are well known basically for Untermeyer's kind of cross-examination of J.P. Morgan. And this is, I believe it was, I'm going to say junior. So, not J.S. Morgan, but J.P. Morgan, and then Jack was his son, right? And he doesn't even say in Warburg's book, basically, he doesn't even call it the Pujo Committee. I don't know if it's just it wasn't called that specifically or what, but he basically just says the money trust investigation under the whip of the energetic Samuel Untermeyer, right? And then basically this stirred up the country and the rift between Roosevelt and Taft and a few other things as well, right? I just remember it's the Pujo Committee because I'm also studying the House of Morgan, right, at this time. And so that's something that's still recent in my mind, per se. And I remember that Samuel Untermeyer was the head lawyer, it seemed, in those hearings, in terms of actually, I guess, prosecuting the quote-unquote money trust. But anyway, keeping that in mind on the general sentiment towards central banking at the time, right? This wasn't like, especially with the fear of Wall Street, as I was talking about earlier, where you had basically the major concern a couple years before was the bankers or private entities and stuff did not want a central banking entity to be under Wall Street control, right? And so this kind of major famous investigation of the money trust with the Pujo Committee was also happening at this time where you were thinking about having a central banking entity. So basically that's showing, or that leads me to think that that would be a headwind towards Wall Street control of a central bank, right? Now, and I say this from the perspective of where we are at this specific time in late 1911, right? To where the Federal Reserve has not been enacted yet. It's not a thing just yet. So they're trying to get this passed. And so it is a headwind in terms of getting it passed to have whatever entity they come up with controlled by Wall Street in any way. So basically, I think this is also maybe why there was such a change in control in terms of between the Aldrich Plan and the Federal Reserve Act, to where the Aldrich Plan had much more private sector control in terms of like the Fed presidents, like of the actual reserve banks, the district banks and such. And you had much more in terms of the different kind of, I guess, tiers of the Fed governors, right? Where you have like the different classes like A, B, and C, where you have like, I think it's like a third or so are, drawing a blank, but a third are appointed by the president, a third are appointed by the Fed, I don't know, by the Fed district banks, and then a third are by their peers or something like that. For some reason it's running away from me in my mind right now. So regardless, I just kind of wanted to give some more specific examples of basically how at this point in time, a couple years before the actual passage of the Federal Reserve Act, that kind of the private business and banking community was for it. And we also saw this with the funding for the National Citizens League, how the vast majority of it came from the banking community in general, right? And we talked about that in the previous video about that specific funding and such for the Federal Reserve Act. And since I say that, I might as well try to find the exact quote possibly, but I don't want to waste too much of your guys' time. Let's see. Might be it. Oh, yes. Among the most liberal contributors were the banks, which had swung into line and by this time had become warm supporters of the campaign. And the campaign is talking about the League of the National Citizens League, right? Basically, the whole somewhat of a propaganda campaign to muster up support for central banking in general in the United States, right? So, with that, I'm going to leave this one here. So, yeah, I don't think I have anything else to say. But anyways, I'm going to leave this one here. So I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you on the next one.